Good afternoon. Today I'd like to discuss one of the chief legacies of the French Revolution, its reconfiguration of the relationship between territory, sovereignty, and citizenship. One of the products of this transformation was the figure of the émigré, whose definition through a series of increasingly severe laws throughout the 1790s equated the physical frontiers of the Republic with the bounds of Republican citizenship. The émigré became the antitype of the Republican citizen under an ideal territorial nationhood, a uniform set of laws, duties, and rights operating over every inch of French soil. Yet, what I want to argue is that the question of immigration became most pressing for revolutionaries and their enemies on the colonial periphery, precisely where the Republican ideal of a unitary nation state of equal citizens confronted a system predicated on racial hierarchy. This was also a place where the question, who is an immigrant, was especially urgent and difficult to answer. The Atlantic world was awash with human jetsam assigned with several often disputed labels: émigré, réfugié, déporté. The unstable application of these categories to displaced people by an assortment of political actors was central to debates about the future of the colonial system. This was true both for French Republican authorities and for their rivals, the British. Throughout the crucial period between the outbreak of the Revolution and the Peace of Amiens in 1802, colonial migration policy on both sides was marked by a mix of inclusive and exclusive impulses. This was driven by the perceived need to distinguish between desirable and undesirable migrants. And depending on the circumstances, both sides responded to the problem with everything from humanitarian assistance to surveillance, ideological vetting, mass confiscations, and deportations. These policies didn't just develop in parallel, they were part of an interactive system of violence, population movement, and competing projects of remaking the plantation complex of the Caribbean. Seen through this lens, the problem of the émigré appears as something more than just a product of revolutionary political culture. Rather, French colonial exiles became transimperial actors and objects of policy. By transimperial, I mean not simply that exiles crossed imperial boundaries, but that they served as vectors and accelerants of specifically imperial problems, debates, and practices that circulated across the French and British empires. Understanding the central role that exile and migration policy played in the colonial revolutions requires us to look beyond the metropole-colony dyad and beyond the French colonial empire itself, following the routes of exile across islands, oceans, and national frontiers. For both the French and British empires, the displacement of colonists became an imposing political and administrative challenge. Part of this was sheer numbers. As many as 30,000 French citizens were dispersed around the Caribbean and North America during the revolutionary decades. A much greater proportion of the colonial population went into exile compared to the metropole, even when you leave aside the exceptional case of Saint-Domingue and the end of white colonial society there. For example, Guadeloupe's émigré lists show that more than 3,000 people had fled or been deported by 1796. This is about 20% of the free population before the revolution was gone. Some communities on the receiving end, meanwhile, were swamped. As early as the spring of 1792, a Spanish visitor in Kingston in Jamaica observed that there were as many Frenchmen as Englishmen there. This high rate of displacement stemmed from a chaotic political environment and a high degree of mobility across islands and national boundaries. Under those conditions, one of the other chief problems for French or British state actors trying to regulate this wave of migration was its heterogeneous composition. French émigré laws effectively equated unauthorized departure with disloyalty, but from an early stage, revolutionary leaders recognized that the reality on the ground was more complex. So, for example, in August 1792, the Legislative Assembly provided exceptions to the immigration laws for Caribbean colonists who had fled to foreign islands or the United States to escape slave revolts or factional conflicts. And in the face of those conflicts and in looming threats of war with Britain, colonial administrators made attempts to smooth over the factional antipathies of the early revolutionary years. In 1793, for instance, the French administration in Martinique issued a call for émigrés to return to the island, declaring that the internal strife was finished and all citizens should rally to the defense of the patrie. Later that year, however, as the colonial royalists joined forces with the British to wage war on the Republic in Saint-Domingue and in the Windward Islands, immigration policies hardened. absent colonists who had not returned to defend the colonies, along with anyone who left without authorization in the future, were to be placed on emigre lists and were subject to expulsion or worse if they returned. And the swings between magnanimity and severity continued to mark Republican policy toward emigres in the colonial sphere for the next decade. However, Republican policy may be something of a misnomer. There wasn't any single Republican policy. There was a wide range of conflicting policies toward exiles enacted by a range of actors on both sides of the Atlantic. The need to vet displaced colonists was particularly pressing for French consular officials in the United States, as they became increasingly flooded with refugees seeking assistance as fighting in Saint-Domingue intensified in 1793 and 94. And their response is revealing of the pressures facing men on the spot, so to speak, as they made French colonial migration policy. The New York consulate, among others, was flooded with refugees, especially after the fall of Cap Français in 1793. And it responded to the crisis by chartering several vessels to carry refugees to the metropole under a flag of truce. But the officials were wary of the risk of admitting, quote, enemies of the state who have escaped our surveillance. And their response was to form a committee of verification to vet the applicants for the refugee ships. The consul general's instructions to the committee were clear, quote, it is necessary that every expatriated Frenchman give an accounting of his absence from the Republic. Only those whose exile was a involuntary misfortune were to be readmitted. Establishing that meant loyalty oaths, it meant affidavits of travel and residence history, sometimes doctor's notes, letters of recommendation from colonial officials. But establishing these credentials with one organ of the Republic was no guarantee of safety. Breakdowns in communication or political rivalries between different jurisdictions ensured that some colonists who were regarded as citizens in good standing in one place might be proscribed elsewhere. So in one case, a immigrant was placed on the immigration list in Guadeloupe. He fled to Saint-Domingue, and there he was given an officer's commission in the Republican forces. Another tale of administrative oversight that was brought up by the governor of Guadeloupe, Victor Hugo, was even more remarkable. A nobleman who owned property in Guadeloupe managed to secure his removal from the metropolitan emigre list and planned to leave for France by way of St. Thomas. All the while, he was officially still a captain in a British regiment stationed in occupied Martinique. The Republican commissioner, as I said, in Guadeloupe, Victor Hugo, he particularly developed a grudge against the French consular agents in the United States because he saw them as condoning illicit reentry to both the colonies and the metropole. He repeatedly complained to the Ministry of Colonies about these consular officials, about how they were providing residence papers to emigres who had served with British forces against the Republic. And he also complained that these emigres then became vocal critics of his administration after they returned. And as this complaint suggests, the uncertain blend of loyalties and intentions among French colonists meant that the politics of the colonial revolution extended onto foreign territory. This was the assumption underlying the attempts by French authorities to rally displaced citizens to the Republic. To give another example of that, a planter named Rudé in 1794 had been deported to France from Saint-Domingue by the Republican commissioners due to factional disputes there, but then he managed to secure the backing of the Committee of Public Safety to go to New England, not only to get his family who had fled there, but also to spread information and propaganda among the French exile community. Later that year, in December 1794, Victor Hugo managed to secure the arrival of 2,000 volunteers of exiles from the United States, most of whom had been deported by the British from Martinique, to return to Guadeloupe to serve in the Republican forces there. And he issued a proclamation later that year to all the remaining Guadeloupeans in the United States, promising that all those who had not borne arms against the Republic would be welcomed back. Protestations of loyalty to the Republic, however, did not preclude many exiles from attacking the policies of racial equality and emancipation that were being enacted in the colonies. Hugo, for example, had good reason to fear their influence. The fate of the Republican commissioners in Saint-Domingue, Polverel, and Sontenax illustrate the volatility of the issue. Those two commissioners were recalled to the metropole and impeached in 1795, in large part through the lobbying efforts of Dominican exiles in the United States and their allies in Paris. Polverel died while the inquest was ongoing. Sontenax was exonerated and reinstated, which allowed him to pursue his revenge on the emigres. In 1796, he banned all exiles from returning to the colony, and forbade the French consuls in the United States from issuing passports to these, quote, eternal enemies of the principles of France. This measure did not in of itself explicitly define all Dominions abroad as émigrés, but returning to the metropole without official endorsement was dangerous. When the pro-slavery writer Moreau de Saint-Méry arrived in Paris in 1798, after several years of exile in Philadelphia, for example, he was denounced as an émigré, and he had to quickly assemble official documentation to avoid the guillotine. Migration controls and the way that migrants were categorized became tools in a battle over emancipation that stretched across both sides of the Atlantic. And in this battle, stark dividing lines between revolution and counter-revolution were not always much in evidence. Now, the label of émigré lacked the singular ideological importance for the British that it did for the French Republic. But in practice, the range of movement controls issued by British colonial administrators, commanders, and ministers in London sought to address problems that were quite similar. Most of these actors perceived the mobility and politically mixed nature of the immigration as a threat to British interests, even as they sought to leverage ties with counter-revolutionary émigrés. Disdain toward the exiles was common. In one British general's view, they were, quote, a doubtful race, and as few as possible of them ought to be allowed to come out to the British colonies. This ambivalence was driven not primarily by national difference. The problem, rather, was the fundamental similarity between British and French slave societies and the forces that threatened them. The result was a system of policies characterized less by xenophobia than by a drive to defend the shared Caribbean plantation complex against revolutionary contagion from politically and especially racially heterogeneous French migrants. A good case in point is the policies that were enacted in Jamaica amid the influx of French refugees beginning in 1791. The assembly there imposed vetting requirements for new arrivals as well as foreigners that already lived on the island. This included parish-level registration, residency permits that had to be renewed every 15 days. Free colored people with French backgrounds were supposed to provide 2 householders on the island to vouch for them, otherwise they would be deported. This was only the first of a series of expulsions undertaken by colonial administrators over the next decade and a half, which often specifically targeted free people of color and the so-called French blacks. British colonial migration policies reflected the geographic and social proximity of the French colonies to their British counterparts, and that encouraged race and class-based solidarity for some exiles, and simultaneously it provoked fears of immigrants and especially their slaves as agents of an island-hopping revolutionary apocalypse. Now, to be sure, ideological threats among white French colonists were not taken lightly. The fractious internal politics of Saint-Domingue produced multiple successive groups of exiles. Some of them were quite antagonistic to the others. Pro-slavery patriots like the National Guard Commandant Auguste Borel, who had embraced the revolution as a means of promoting colonial autonomy, were anathema to the committed royalists who supported the Bourbons. So when Borel was forced out of Port-au-Prince, he fled to Jamaica, and angry letters immediately started percolating through the transatlantic French immigration and reached London, warning of his corruption, his Republican sympathies, and urging that he be surveilled and preferably deported. But the governor in Jamaica, Adam Williamson, seems to have been charmed by Borel, and even though he admitted he was a, quote, avowed Democrat. Williamson noted approvingly that Borel had resisted the commissioners in Saint-Domingue because of their efforts to extend further privileges to the gens de couleur. In the end, Williamson issued Borel a passport and sent him to New York, relieving both the émigrés and himself of a political liability. But the Borel affair underscores that while white French exiles might fall under suspicion of revolutionary contamination, the politics of race tended to trump other concerns. As a French colonist wrote to the Jamaican planner Edward Shirley in 1793, quote, "It is no longer a matter of aristocrats or Democrats. The question has changed. Is one a white man or a man of color?" The more pronounced racialization of British migration controls reflected the overwhelming imperative to avoid a slave revolt like that of Saint-Domingue. But in a larger sense, both empires were grappling with similar problems, a revolution and a counter-revolution with unclear boundaries, both of them implicated in an ambivalent way with the cause of white supremacy in the colonial world. The consequences of mass exile were not simply a matter of people in motion, but also the property that they left behind. So the disappearance of the masters of thousands of plantation estates and other property through flight or death constituted an unprecedented disruption to economic life in the colonies and to the mechanisms of social control over the enslaved majority. On both sides, governments took control of thousands of seized or abandoned properties through the process of sequestration. This left the French Republic as by far the biggest landlord in the Caribbean, setting the stage for its later experiments in emancipation and a new system of coerced labor over the ex-slaves. All émigrés forfeited their property, which was labeled the biens nationaux. This was the same term applied to the expropriated church property that formed the basis of the assignat currency in the metropole. Émigré properties were, if anything, more important to the fate of the colonial revolution. The new multiracial citizen armies that the Republic raised in the 1790s were funded by the biens nationaux. The sale of émigré goods and products covered as much as 50 million livres in military expenses in the Windward Islands between 1793 and 96. So given this strategic importance, it's perhaps unsurprising that some of the very first measures publicly decreed after the arrival of the Republican commissioners in Martinique concerned the sequestration and supervision of émigré property, notably coming just before orders to disarm slaves. Both the ideological and fiscal necessity for Republican colonial leaders of exploiting confiscated property drove them towards more coercive approaches towards slaves, or after emancipation, the cultivateurs. Shortly after his arrival in Guadeloupe in 1794, Victor Hugo noted that there was, quote, a huge quantity of coffee plantations seized from the émigrés, which promised a huge harvest, but he noticed both labor and management were missing. As Hugo saw it, quote, most of the citizens of the countryside have deserted their plantations to take refuge in the city, where, unconcerned about the public good, they wallow in laziness, hide from the public authorities, and give themselves to all kinds of secret banditry to survive. Now, Hugues' drive to eradicate this so-called laziness, which Republicans associated with both slavery and aristocracy, became an ideological leitmotif of his administration. But it's significant that the desertion of the plantation by its black workforce was a direct consequence of its abandonment by its white owners. This illicit mobility on both ends of the social scale, inside and outside the colony, reinforced one another. Hugues' zeal against the émigrés and the recalcitrant cultivateurs was of a piece. In this sense, neither group was where they were supposed to be. Now, the British, true to counter-revolutionary form, used old regime legal mechanisms to handle the confiscation and management of estates in the French colonies they occupied. They placed these properties on an official list known as the Régie du Roi. However, the means of administering the Régie quickly became more complex and far-reaching in response to the fragmented state of French colonial society. The occupying administrations in Martinique and Saint-Domingue initially sequestered only the properties of owners known to be resident on enemy territory, but later they added the estates of any proprietor who had not left Republican France after 1794 or who had reportedly borne arms against the British. As time passed, after the British invasions of Saint-Domingue and the Windward Islands, numerous immigrant proprietors attempted to regain control of their estates, either in person by traveling to the colonies or via proxies. Addressing these claims required British officials to adjudicate the movements and loyalties of foreign subjects across the entire Atlantic world. So, for example, one nobleman, the Comte de la Touche, lost his property in Martinique because he had taken a journey to France. He was then living in exile in Philadelphia, and from there he lobbied the British government via his immigrant contacts in London to see if he could get his property back. This gives you some idea of the geographic spread and complexity of what's going on here. Absentee owners were sometimes permitted to retain their property if they could prove their residence in British or neutral territory, but this offered a ready-made way to skirt the rules. So, for example, immigrants might set up house in a neutral location such as Hamburg, just long enough to obtain the certification from a British consulate to get their property back before returning to France. British sequestration policies, like those of the French, aimed to feed military and administrative budgets and to punish their political enemies. However, the connection between these two sets of policies on each side was deeper. The measures for vetting proprietors in the occupied islands was the closest that British colonial refugee policy came to the mirror image of the French immigrant laws. The past or present fact of presence on Republican-controlled soil became a basis for confiscation of property and, in some cases, expulsion of individuals. Now, these regulations didn't constitute as far-reaching a civic and ideological project as Republican immigrant legislation did. Nonetheless, attempts to manage this mobile and politically divided immigration alongside the plantation economy produced shared patterns of policy. On both sides, the bounds of the colonial revolution and counter-revolution were defined increasingly in territorial terms. Now, it was no coincidence that Republican efforts beginning in the later 1790s to relax immigration and excuse me, immigration and sequestration laws coincided with changing attitudes towards slavery. The policy shift was anticipated by several attempts in the French legislature in 1798 to subsidize the return of colonists to Saint-Domingue, and as well as by the government of Toussaint Louverture, who was himself aiming to rebuild the plantation economy by welcoming exiled planters. By 1801, the French administration under Jean-Baptiste Lacrosse in Guadeloupe was allowing widespread readmission of immigrants. Those who, quote, have proven themselves constantly the enemies of the Republican government were still to be excluded, but others could regain their homes and even some compensation for lost property. At that point, the colonial administrators sought to reassure the free black cultivateurs that any compensation for exiles would not be to their disadvantage and that obligations of the state towards citizens of all races would remain unchanged. But that notional balancing act did not last long. After the Treaty of Amiens, March 1802, whose terms included a broad amnesty for most émigrés, the Napoleonic consulate moved decisively towards the reestablishment of French colonial society on the basis of slavery. Though the turn towards amnesty was not unique to the colonial context, migration policy would prove integral to the policy of retrenchment of slavery in the New World. So the consulate first tightened movement controls over non-whites. There was a decree in June of 1802 that forbade any black or gens de couleur colonists from the Antilles moving into the Louisiana territory. Violators were to be deported. The government next turned its attention to exiled planters. A decree that September declared that the reestablishment of order depends principally on the presence of proprietors on their property. Displaced planters from Saint-Domingue and Guadeloupe were to return to the colonies with, quote, the shortest delay under penalty of the continued sequestration of their estates. Once there, they were required to obtain residence certificates and provide proof of non-immigration or removal from the emigre list, and in return, their property would be restored. A subsequent decree sweetened the deal by suspending the collection of debts from the Saint-Domingue proprietors, something the British had done as well. The consulate aimed to help rebuild the colonial empire through an engineered reversal of a decade of displacement of the slave-owning class. Now, of course, Bonaparte's designs for Saint-Domingue ultimately failed, and it became an independent Haiti, but the decision to restore the slave system meant that the prior tension between the exclusive and inclusive impulses in Republican migration policy were essentially resolved, at least for white colonists. The Peace of Amiens did not entirely end the influx of French colonial exiles in British territory. Prior to the handover of Martinique to the French, colonists who were fearful of the new regime because of their collaboration with the British were offered land grants in Trinidad, which at that time was a predominantly Francophone colony. Jamaica, meanwhile, received a further wave of refugees from Saint-Domingue after the failed French reconquest. The Colonial House of Assembly demanded that, in the wake of this, demanded that exiles of almost every description be removed, and within a couple of years, most of them were. Another group of Dominicans who were expelled from Cuba in 1808 were also given an unfriendly welcome in Jamaica, and ultimately most of the French of any color left the island, voluntarily or not, although a small number integrated into Jamaican society. But anxieties of revolutionary contamination left a long legacy. So as late as 1804, Le Canon et Coffrey, two Jamaican-born men of free-colored Domingan descent, were banished from the island as aliens and dangerous persons for their advocacy for colored rights, which was construed as a conspiracy to reenact the Saint-Domingue uprising. Local reactions largely broke down around racial rather than national lines, with white French emigres testifying against the pair. The question is one a white man or a man of color who had not lost its salience a generation after the colonial exodus began. Peter Salons, in his account of the formation of the integral territorial nation of France along the border with Spain, observes that, quote, it was only by abolishing privilege as the basis of private and administrative law that the revolutionary government could institute a direct link between power and territory. Now, if the attempt to impose this link in the colonies through controls on movement was particularly intense and fraught with contradictions, it was in part because the colonial world was the site of the most totalizing form of private law, namely slavery. The fate of that institution, its beneficiaries and its victims, their location inside or outside the frontiers of sovereignty and citizenship, became inextricably bound with that of immigration and its own challenges to the project of imperial nationhood. The crossing of borders and the breaking of chains in many ways were interpenetrating test cases of the limits of the Universal Republic. But the interplay between them was far more than just a story of the Republicans' internal contradictions. As we've seen, there was no strictly internal revolution. It's a general truth, but an especially vital one for understanding the nature and stakes of the upheavals in the colonial Atlantic. Mass exile operated in many ways as the opposite pole of slave resistance within the crisis of what contemporaries increasingly recognized as a shared colonial system. Each pole of that crisis created a set of strategic problems for the two empires that drove entangled and not simply parallel approaches to migration policy. And what we saw as a result of that was an increasingly territorialized logic, despite the gulf of ideology and interest between each side. The mobility of populations in the wartime Caribbean threatened to upend any particular arrangement of territory, citizenship, property, and race in colonial society, as revolution and counter-revolution shadowed one another across the routes of exile. It was this transimperial predicament that made exile a central component of the revolutionary experience in the New World.